Hello and welcome to another edition of GNet TV News Project's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNet TV. It's my pleasure to be with you today. Today is Tuesday, March 13th, and it's also our pleasure to have with us in the studio Dr. Dan Freilich, who is running for U.S. Congress. He's going to be running in the Democratic primary against the incumbent, Peter Welch. So we'll have that to look forward to as the election season goes on. Primary coming up sometime in mid-August, I believe, August
Correct.
14th, I think. Dr. Freilich, great to have you with us today.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Pleasure to have you in to talk about some of the issues that you'll be running on and be talking about as the campaign goes on. Dr. Freilich lives in Brownsville, Vermont, which is over near West Windsor. He works there at the VA Hospital Medical Center in White River Junction as an internist and a physician specializing in infectious diseases. Hope I got that right.
You did.
Some of you may remember that back in 2010, Dr. Freilich ran for the U.S. Senate against Pat Leahy in the Democratic primary, and then in the general election as an independent candidate. Of course, as we know, Senator Leahy is still in Washington, so that didn't turn out to be quite as successful as you may have hoped in the beginning, but back again now for a second try. And so tell us, Dan, what prompted you to run now? What motivated you to throw your hat back in the ring again?
First of all, it's great to be here, and I appreciate you taking the time to do this. The reason that I'm running this time is, in point of fact, not that different than why I ran the first time. I became pretty committed during the height of the war with OIF and OEF when I was working at Walter Reed about the concept of honorable service. And to use a very simple word, it's honor. And the question is how honor translates to effective governance, which I'm going to come back to in a moment. But step number one is to, in my mind, step up to the plate if you are a public servant and try to assure those who you are representing that their interests are being advocated for. Corporations actually have fiduciary responsibilities for their stockholders. It's fascinating that we actually do not have a legal fiduciary requirement for elected officials in the United States because, frankly, we've made corruption legal. So in our country, it is more than okay, and it is more than legal, although it's not right, that our leaders take hundreds of thousands of dollars, in some cases millions of dollars, from special interests, which obviously prevent them from being able to be objective arbiters. So at the time I was taking care of a lot of casualties. I actually had the mea culpa moment when I made a decision to run. And I was walking in, I was leading my infectious diseases team. We walked into an ICU with a horrifically injured soldier from Iraq or Afghanistan, I don't remember which, tubes coming in from in and out everywhere. And as our team walked in, Andrew, he literally tried to get out of the bed and to step up and salute. And the anecdote of that, in concert with, at the time, I was spending a lot of time with a lot of congressmen. There's something called CODELs, which are congressional delegations, and Navy physicians. So I've been in the Navy for 23 years. Navy physicians go on CODELs to sort of keep the people safe, or you're there in case something ever happens. So the point is, I had this dichotomy of seeing how some Americans step up to the plate and sacrifice and give so much, yet the politicians are not willing to do the absolute minimum. And I don't think it's asking too much that they try to have unconflicted, more professional and modern representation so that they can represent all of us and not just specific special interests.
Now, is this an area or shortcoming you feel Mr. Welch is guilty
absolutely.
of?
Absolutely. He's
part of the overall big problem.
Yes. Up front, I kind of like to say, when I make a comparison with the person I'm running against, I really try to avoid any kind of sort of being negative. What I'm trying to do is tell the truth and make comparisons, because you have to make comparisons if you're running. But I would say up front that I don't think Peter Welch is any worse than all the other congressmen. The problem is that the bar is so low because almost all of them are willing to participate in this process. Now, there are some of them who are not and step up to the plate. I mean, Mr. Sanders has recently stopped taking special interest money, certainly in the 2016 presidential election. The New York senator from one right over the Lake Champlain has just announced that she's stopping taking corporate money.
This would be Kristen Gillibrand?
That is correct. So there are those who are willing to step up and recognize sort of the yearnings of the population for more professional, unconflicted representation. So to answer your question specifically about Mr. Welsh, again, I'm going to repeat what I said a moment ago. He doesn't take any more than anyone else, but that's not the point. He's our congressman, and he takes hundreds of thousands of dollars from corporations. He takes thousands specifically from pharmaceutical companies, from pharmaceutical distribution companies, from insurance companies, from doctors' groups, all the ones that you're going to have to look in the eye and regulate if you are going to switch our economy to a Medicare for All system. He takes thousands of dollars from fossil fuel companies, the kind of companies that you're going to have to look in the eye also similarly and regulate and say enough is enough if we're going to transform to a carbon fuel-free economy eventually. And finally, to even espouse campaign finance reform, which my party frankly does quite a bit. We're always talking about Citizens United, we got to repeal Citizens United and do everything we can. But it's easy for Democratic politicians to do that with the left hand while they keep taking the money. It doesn't cost them anything. And I don't think that's leadership.
So your big concern is that we have a situation where special interests, corporations, certain individuals can give large campaign contributions for the re-election of incumbent office holders, and that makes it impossible for them to kind of adjudicate or make decisions that come up that might be not in the best interest, shall we say, of those special interests that have opened up their checkbooks.
Without question. I mean, look, there are three rationalizations that politicians redundantly state as to why it's okay, especially politicians who have a conscience, such as Peter Welsh. There are others who I don't think really care about these issues, but I bet deep down this does bother him, but he's still willing, for whatever reason, to ignore it. So statement number one is typically that the money doesn't affect me. Statement number two is often that they take money from good organizations. And I don't know why this is stated. The fact that the money doesn't affect them is preposterous. All the scientific studies say that the return on investment is, I've seen, anywhere from $200 to $700 for every dollar invested by a lobbyist on behalf of a corporate PAC. They tend to get $200 to $700 back in tax benefits. And for the sake of discussion, what if Peter Welsh, for example, is a saint? And all those statistics address all the other congressmen, but not him, because he's perfect. It is even possible, although unlikely. If that's the case, participating in the system still enables the system and allows everyone else to do it.
What's the answer then? Well, how would you do things differently? Or how do you expect to conduct your campaign and raise enough funds to kind of keep it going if we're going to play by a different set of rules?
So I only take money from individuals. I will not ever, and do not now, take any money from any special interests. That would include PACs, corporations, unions, organizations, anybody other than a voter, a person. Mm-hmm. I think it's much more egalitarian and it's distributed quite widely, and it's very difficult to become encumbered to anybody in particular because there are limits to how much each can give. It is difficult to tie your hand and to compete. I'm the first to admit. Nevertheless, we only announced in January. We've been raising money for a few months. We've raised close to $50,000 in less than a few months. And my philosophy is that telling the truth and doing it the right and the moral and the right sense with integrity is that I believe, I don't want to say that the meek shall inherit the earth, but I do believe that goodness wins, and that if I can win, it's possible we can extend a movement. Like I said, there are a few other leaders who see that this is the future. Look, the young people, the millennials, they're not going to tolerate this anymore. I mean, my opinion of the millennials is that unlike my baby boomer population or age group, they don't tolerate BS. And this is frankly BS. Politicians saying that they're there and advocating for the people but taking the money is simply that. It's legal corruption. There's nothing else you can call it. And the young people, they're going to call it out. And if politicians don't switch today, they're going to have to switch in 5 or 10 years because I'm convinced that America is going to move forward. And there will be either leaders who participated in moving us forward, or there'll be basically anchors who will be footnotes in history.
Okay. Well, I mean, clearly that's one element of your platform that's quite important. Two others that seem to be also high on the list there are healthcare reform and taxes. And I guess I'd like to invite you to tell us a little bit about your feelings on those two subjects. As a doctor, and I should have mentioned your service in the Navy in the introduction to start, you get an up-close view of how we do healthcare in this country. And I gather you're a fan of a single-payer system. So is that what you would like to see implemented? And if you were elected, you would be pushing for that?
Oh, very, very avidly. I mean, there are some people, they're kind of single-payer zealots. It's sort of like, it's almost a religiosity for them. For me, I think of it much more scientifically. I look at it economically. I look at it from a moral point of view without bias. I look at a quality point of view. I look at trying to bend the curve. I try to look for universal coverage. And when one looks at all the data, there's really no other option that you can think of that works. So Medicare spends about 1.8% of its money on indirect costs, administrative costs. Private industry spends over 13%. And that's not an aberrancy. Every other country that has single payer, for example, Canada, has the same kind of numbers. And the reasons are that you don't spend a lot of money on denial management and advertising, paying CEOs a lot, all the things when you see all those skyscrapers in Hartford, it's because all those insurance companies have these huge staffs taking care of things. And the same thing when you go to your doctor's office or when you go to a hospital. Why are there billing offices that are gigantic in hospitals, or for a small doctor's office, there'll be 2, 3, 4, 5 people doing billing? It's because of the inefficiencies of our multi-payer system. So the second part of that is that this is a huge anchor, I guess I used that term earlier, but why not, on business in the United States. So America, we spend about $10,000 per person on healthcare. Most modern democracies, the mean for the OECD countries is about 4,000. Let's just call it even numbers and say double, 10,000 to 5,000 to make it simple numbers. That means that when industry, and actually industry spends more because employer-based health insurance tends to be more expensive than the mean of 10,000 in the United States, but we'll just use those numbers for simplicity. That means that when we're trying to sell a product overseas, our employers are spending about $10,000 per employee, and that hits your bottom line. You have to raise prices. If it was France or Canada or Japan, they'd be spending $4,000 or $5,000. So when Trump, for example, says that he wants tariffs on steel, my philosophy is that in general, kind of like life in general, and actually this is probably good marital therapy, always try to fix yourself first and then look at the problems that others are bringing to the table. And we in America have made a decision, for example, that we're going to have a very expensive and frankly not even that effective, but expensive healthcare system. And then you wonder, as an example, why we have difficulty selling things like steel. So if I was President Trump, the first thing I'd say is how can we make our steel more competitive rather than just slapping tariffs on others who've made good decisions, for example, to make their healthcare cheap, so that they can charge less for steel.
Well, a couple of years ago when Peter Shulman was governor, he tried to bring a single-payer system to Vermont and eventually backed away from it because it was just, the numbers didn't work. It was just going to be too expensive. So what makes you think that we're going to be able to kind of bring that into play on a national level? I mean, look at all the difficulty we had with Obamacare, or getting that passed and working through that, and still there's so much resistance to it still out there. I mean, the national GOP was unsuccessful last year in trying to overturn it, but clearly it remains a very controversial idea. Single payer is going a step or three beyond that.
It's funny, in 2010 I actually opposed the ACA. even running as a Democrat. It's not that I didn't think that it was going to help, but I thought all the oxygen for healthcare reform was going to be utilized on this Band-Aid that really was a maintenance of our current multi-payer system, just a little bit of a better system. I kind of can understand those who still, look, if you advocate for single payer, you are advocating for business people, actually, because the total savings would be $400 to $600 billion a year if you did exact same coverage that we have now. Now, honestly, we wouldn't have that much benefit because we would extend coverage, we would cover dental, we would have home coverage, there'd be Medicaid would be reimbursed at the same level as the rest of Medicaid. You wouldn't have these sort of artificial inequities where the poor get treated poorly because their doctors don't get paid very well. But to back up to Mr. Shumlin in 2014, Green Mountain Care, it's not that the numbers didn't add up. There were two big problems, to the best of my understanding of that. The first one was that I understand that Mr. Shumlin, I almost called him doctor and he deserves it, but after spending all that time working on it, was not willing to politically have the nuanced conversation with Vermont voters that taxes overall would go up, but the premiums would go down much more. And that the net for the average Vermonter was actually going to be hundreds of dollars less per year. The second point is that when you do a state system, you still are stuck with the federal issues, and there were terrible issues that had to be worked through with respect to waivers for waiving ACA money, waiving Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE, and finally ERISA, which is the law that precludes states from regulating privately financed healthcare systems, which some of our large companies do. All these waivers were possible, but they were very difficult. I think that that was difficult, but the bigger issue was that one had to have a very thorough conversation with the people. But I'm not disagreeing with you that it is difficult to do at the state level, because if you do it at the state level, you still have to interact with all the other states, and you still have a multi-payer system to some extent. So some of the advantages go away, and that was why the savings were only, to the best estimate that I understand, in the hundreds per person and not thousands per person.
Let's move on to the tax question, because on your website you say that you would like to see some kind of overhaul of the way we tax ourselves here. And I'm going to assume, take a wild guess here, that you didn't find a lot to like with the recent tax overhaul that was pushed through down in Washington, D.C. shortly before Christmas. That kind of went in the opposite direction. But I'll let you tell us about what would you do or be advocating for if elected in terms of tax reform.
So in terms of just 1 second on Trump's tax policy, it gave huge benefits for those who didn't need it. For the ultra wealthy, there were little tidbits given briefly to the middle class when you and working class. When you do the math, all the tidbit benefits, which were very small, that's why I used the word tidbit, to the middle class and working people go away, they expire over time. The corporate benefits persist, and those for the ultra wealthy persist. On balance, there was an enormous loss of money over the next 10 years for working people in the middle class. So from my point of view, if Democrats can take over the House again at some point, and the Senate, and have veto proof in case Trump is still there, or hopefully there's a Democratic president, number one is just repeal that up front. But then you're stuck with being back in 2017, which wasn't exactly equitable either, because my interpretation of the history of the United States economically in the last 10 to 20 years is that the alt-right has systematically dismantled any sense of fair progressive taxation that was the mantra of both Democrats and Republicans throughout the 20th century. That ultra-liberal Mr. Nixon, that other ultra-liberal Eisenhower allowed the upper marginal tax rate on income tax under Nixon. It was still in the 70s. Under Eisenhower, it was in the 90s. So what has happened is that the income tax, at the very least, that was the only one that was progressive, but it was like this. And now it's gone like this. And what people don't notice is that the curve, if you go past the 1%, it looks a little bit progressive, but then it starts going down again. And you're ultra rich, and that's why Buffett says that his effective tax rate is much lower than his secretary's. The payroll tax is incredibly regressive, where Social Security taxes are only applied for the first, it changes every year, but about $120,000 on your W-2 earned income.
That's one thing I've never understood. What is the rationale for that? Why would you not have that being on people making whatever?
There is no rationale for it. And the second part to it is even more cynical part. So under earned income, it ends at 120,000, or so, I mean, about 120. So if you make $1 million, your first $100,000 or so, you just like everyone, and then you're home free. Yeah. But most wealthy people, ultra wealthy in particular, most of their money is not W-2 income, it's capital gains. Right. And the capital gains rate, 0. No payroll tax, no Social Security taxes. So you don't, and then you wonder why the Social Security trust fund is broke. You could fix that in a moment by just making the capital gains also taxed for Social Security and remove what's called the tax max in W-2. Mm-hmm. How about capital gains? Capital gains are at 15 to 20%, depending on how much money you make, for long-term capital gains, which is not that long, it's only a year. Again, the ultra-rich make most of their money from capital gains, so they pay very little payroll taxes. They don't have much income tax because most of their income is from capital gains. And then you charge the capital gains at a much lower level than middle-income people. And then you wonder why we have a wealth inequality and an income inequality level that is so dramatic that anybody who reads history objectively will know that you always end up with revolution. Now, I don't know if it's dramatic revolution and shooting on the streets, but it certainly is going to be violent and unpleasant for my children over the next 10 or 20 or 30 years if we persist this way.
What do you see as the biggest problems in Vermont? If you were again successful in this effort here and you go to Washington, when you got down to Washington D.C., what would be in your mind as what are the big problems in Vermont? I mean, we talked about taxes, campaign finance reform, and healthcare, but there are other issues I'm sure that are on your mind.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to single it into one word, I guess 2 words, 3 words. The economy is stupid. So economics is always number one, but if you don't mind, I just want to back up on Vermont just a little bit, because I think there's 2 sides with respect to Vermont that I view the role of our congressman. Number one is I feel that Vermont is really small and has 2 ways of conducting our future. One is to go along to get along and allow the values of the rest of the country sort of to become Vermont values and just let it happen and be part of the pack in Congress, for example. The other one is to make a decision that we Vermonters are going to be leaders. We're going to be the tip of the spear politically, economically, socially, civics. And we are going to do everything we can in Congress, and here too, but we'll come to that in a moment, to push the agenda to a topic and a policy discussion that is more commensurate with our values. And I think that is worth backing up to even further, because I think Vermont values are pretty special. It's probably why ultimately you moved here, and it's clearly the reason that I moved here. And we have a dedication to fair play, to communal spirit, to thinking about our neighbor, to caring about the environment. We've been leaders in the past in the Civil War. When Gettysburg couldn't get done, there was the pickets charge by Vermonters, and they made it happen. The Green Mountain Boys, and to be a little bit more proximal in timing, I would give a lot of credit to Bernie Sanders, whether one agrees, depending on your politics, with each policy agenda item of his. There is no question that for one senator out of 100, he has an enormous influence in sort of spreading and changing the discussion on wealth inequality, on campaign finance reform. So I feel that our congressmen, we need to insist maximum stepping up to the plate, using the bully pulpit, not going along to get along, being a leader who's charging, for example, being one of the first congressmen to say, I'm not taking special interest anymore. I'm going to fight for a return to progressive and fair taxation. I'm going to be fighting for Medicare for all, not just saying that I'm for it, but spending every moment of my sort of awake hours fighting for this. And the same for climate and the threat to our globe. And the second part is how he or she, and hopefully we'll have a she congressman one of these days as well, interacts with leading in Vermont per se. And you said, for example, there's going to be the 17-minute walkout tomorrow with respect to guns. I'm definitely going to be there. I'm going to go to the Brattleboro High School. I think that our leaders need to be in the state and that they have to be at the forefront. They have to use their bully pulpit to have, I'm making this up, 100 Vermonters in front of the White House protesting every day. If it's about guns this particular month, that's the issue. When we're discussing healthcare, every day the President of the United States and the remainder of Congress and CNN and MSNBC see that Vermont are leaders, and that they don't just sit back and take it. They step forward. And the same with back in Vermont and Montpelier is that we need leaders who are proactive in working with the governor and working with the legislature to transform our economy together into something that works. You asked what's important in Vermont. I'm slowly getting back to the economy, to an economy that works for all of us. Transforming to a green economy, becoming a powerhouse, kind of like a Denmark for Europe, but a sort of Vermont for the United States. Centers of excellence for renewables and for mass transit, factories that are producing this at good levels, spreading and becoming carbon fuel here because we eliminate some of the silly rules that we have that have actually made our solar industry go backwards. These are the things that, in my opinion, we need to be we need to be fighting for together as a team effort.
Well, we're going to have to leave that there for now, Dr. Freilich, but I want to thank you for coming down and driving across the state on this snowy day here to be with us today and share your views with us. As I said at the start of the telecast, Dr. Freilich is running for the U.S. Congress as a Democrat, challenging Peter Welch in the Democratic primary that's going to be coming up this coming August. And thanks again for being here, and I'm sure we'll have more opportunities to talk as the campaign goes on.
Thank you so much for your time.
And thank all of you for watching as well. Glad to have you with us today. Hope it's going to be a good one, and we'll see you the next time. Have a good day.